Hey, good morning, everyone. Josh is Severe Weather. Happy Saturday morning, the 20th to you. Hope you guys are having a great weekend so far. It is cold here in the East, I will tell you what. But some major changes are coming next week, which are going to lead to some extreme weather changes, uh, not just in the temperature department, but in other departments like precipitation, wintry weather as well. So we've got ourselves quite a bit to track here in the next couple of days. I'm going to share my screen and focus a lot of this video on a big problem that is set to take place as our cold air gradually retreats and things warm up and moisture returns out of the Pacific. We do have a pretty decent threat here to see an ice storm from North Texas straight on into the Great Lakes and interior of the Northeast next week. And I'm going to break a lot of that down for you guys and talk about the temperature changes we've got coming, the amounts of rain that are coming. I focus some of my video on that and just in general what you can expect out and about today. So here's a look at what we're starting the day with here, 5 a.m. Central Time wind chills. And I'm here in the Carolinas. It's pretty cold. I'm not going to lie. It is nothing compared to our friends to the north and west, but it is coming. And we see wind chills down into the low 20s, all the way down into the Houston area, below freezing in North Florida, where we do have some wind chill advisories in effect. And obviously, the Northeast is pretty darn cold. The Great Lakes, the upper Midwest, which are typically cold in January, are feeling the tug of this piece of the polar vortex. But we do have some changes coming in the next several days, and I'm going to talk about that here in a little bit. Here's a look at our infrared satellite image, and I'm going to point out our next weather maker here. This is a get that off the screen there. This is a pretty intense looking system here. Slow moving circulating storm moving onto the west coast, bringing a feed of very heavy rain into Northern California, heavy snow across the interior of the west as well. And this low pressure system is going to go right across the center of the country. It's going to run into cold air primarily here in the upper Midwest. So for a while, as this moisture streams in and temperatures struggle to get past the freezing mark, we do have a significant threat for an ice storm to take shape here as we head to the very beginning of next week. So you're not going to have any issues today or even tomorrow, but as we get into Monday and Tuesday, that's when the problems start. Across Florida, we continue to have some fairly cloudy weather, but that should improve here. And I think next week overall is going to be our best week of the winter to be in Florida. I'm actually taking advantage of that. I got a work trip scheduled for Orlando for much of next week, so going to be enjoying some warmer weather there. But those of us in the upper Midwest are in the freezer. You see these cold temperatures in place here. This is the infrared picking up very cold surface temperatures well below 0 Fahrenheit. In the Northeast, we've got the polar vortex dropping down. You see the circulation here. That's going to continue to crank up some bands of lake effect snow here today and tonight. Some northwesterly flow bringing some of this cold air in and producing a little bit more snow here across the mid-Ohio River Valley and especially into the Appalachians here. On the east side of the Appalachians, nothing but dry air in place. Definitely chapstick weather, dry skin lotion weather here. Very dry across this portion of the East Coast and the Southeast here through the weekend. But these cold temperatures are going to very quickly be replaced with above average temperatures next week. In some places, we may see a four-day temperature swing of 75 degrees warmer in 4 days than what it's going to be here this weekend. That is very extreme. And when you have that kind of extreme change in temperatures, you're going to see some extremes in the weather as well. Let's take a look at our current advisories across the U.S. A quieter map than what we've seen, but we still have some areas to focus on. These are cold weather advisories here, freeze warnings. But around the Great Lakes and Appalachians, we do have still some winter storm warnings focused on West Virginia currently, and out on the West Coast, some flash flood watches. Here's a closer look at what's going on. And most of West Virginia, except for the northern and eastern panhandles, is under a winter storm warning this morning. Advisories back around Huntington and Marshall University across eastern Kentucky, advisories over the southern half of Ohio, and another winter storm warning, or this may actually be the same one, over the Lake Erie shoreline, northeastern Ohio, northwestern PA, as well as the Lake Michigan shoreline in northwest Indiana and southwest Michigan. Some advisories around that as well. So very intense bands of snow, but we are going to see some lessening of the rates of snow. In fact, I've seen reports of maybe as much as 30 inches of snow here in parts of northwest Indiana. Not a shock if you saw my video yesterday, by the way, but it's very localized. You get 10, 15 miles away from that, and there's very little on the ground. It's just where that band is set up. In the west, we have a flood threat building here in Northern California. Next week, that flood threat shifts northward, but the green here indicates a flash flood watch north of the Bay Area for the time being. Winter storm warning in effect here for the northern Sierra, winter storm watch for the southern Sierra, as well as some of these mountains northeast of LA, and flood watch in effect over portions of west central Colorado, where the snow will be melting as the warm air returns. Here's a look at our NAM model for this weekend. Waves of cold coming across the Great Lakes, interior northeast. Not significant for the big cities at this point. We're going to get by dry, but we may see some flakes over parts of Maine and New Brunswick. The big focus shifts to the west here. Big rainmaker moving onshore here today and tonight. We'll see rain and mountain snow across the southwest here tomorrow. Then moisture starts to pick up across Texas as we have that return flow coming out of the Gulf. Flow aloft out of the southwest sends in the Pacific air mass, sends in the impetus for some pretty significant precipitation. But at the surface, temperatures are still cold. So you start seeing these pinks showing up, indicating the chance for freezing rain. And that threat starts here around sunset tomorrow near the Red River and starts building across Oklahoma overnight tomorrow night, and then up into parts of Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri before daybreak on Monday. Remember, the ground is very cold here this weekend. While it is going to warm up significantly, the ground is not going to respond to that warming overnight tomorrow night or Monday morning. So this could very quickly stick on contact as it falls. It's not going to be super heavy, but enough to cause major issues. So if you're across this region here, do expect some closings and school delays here for the day on Monday from North Texas right on up into Illinois as this spreads northeastward. We're going to then see a threat for heavier rain and thunderstorms building across Texas and the Arklatex region on Monday, and what's going to be multiple days of potentially significant rain. And we're talking about not just inches, but maybe feet in a few places. So the pattern gets very rough here very fast. As this milder air moves east, we will see snow across portions of Canada and the Great Lakes, but very quickly that shifts over to frozen precipitation and then eventually rain here next week. Meanwhile, the West Coast keeps getting hit with rounds of rain. The worst will be early in the week in California. Then the threat continues to grow north of you up into Oregon, Western Washington, and British Columbia. So a gradual shift northward in our jet stream is going to send that moisture north. Here's a look at our potential snow totals for the rest of today. And we still see that possibility of locally a band that could put down close to a foot of snow from now through about, this is Tuesday, so about 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock tonight. And then farther up the Michigan shoreline, maybe 6 inches of new snow falling. Even back into northwest Indiana, a couple more inches are possible today. Lighter amounts, but we could see a little bit of a band shifting down through the Columbus region. And then we see northwesterly flow bringing some snowfall into West Virginia. Generally speaking, an inch or less expected. Off of Lake Huron, we'll also see a band that could produce locally up to 10 inches. In Lake Superior, we start to shut the moisture off, but we could still see a little bit more snow during the day today. Looking at the northeast here, we are going to see snow off of Lakes Erie and Ontario. We generally will see 2 to 3 inches inland here over parts of the ski country and here away from Erie. And maybe potentially 2 to 4 inches in a few bands coming off of Ontario. But unlike last week, when everything got sent along the lakeshore from west, southwest, east, northeast, today's wind flow is out of the northwest, and that sends places like Binghamton and Syracuse into the snow band and lessens the threat in places like Niagara Falls or Rochester, New York. There'll still be some snow, but it shouldn't be super heavy. Back across northern New England, generally speaking, just a light snowfall, higher amounts confined to the higher elevations here. Here's a look at how our pattern evolves for next week. This massive area of cold, this big trough piece of the polar vortex in place is going to very quickly lift out. And then the next trough is going to move into California and the West. And in between, we see a pretty big block setting up where we get into our January thaw for at least a week here. Temperatures are going to be much milder than average. That doesn't mean we won't see winter weather, but we are going to see a break from the extreme cold that we're dealing with this weekend. Take a look at how these heights continue to climb here next week. This is Tuesday afternoon, and a big ridge of high pressure in place over the southwestern Atlantic is going to lead to well above average temperatures very quickly building northward. So we have places right now that are in the teens in the Carolinas that will be in the 60s and 70s later next week. There will be a price to pay for that coming later in the month. There will also be a price to pay with all this moisture coming through the southwest. A very wet El Nino pattern here. So lots of moisture will be moving across the center of the country, parts of the deep south, and up into the northeast as well next week. So it's not going to be just beautifully sunny. It will be warmer, but we are going to see a lot of moisture coming at the price of this big ridge in place. Next weekend still looks quite mild here, but You see some shifting coming. That ridge that's been in place over the eastern United States here this upcoming week shifts into the western United States next week. And that is going to open up the door for much colder air to find its way into the eastern US here at the end of the month of January. And this will also lead to potentially a threat for an East Coast winter storm. I don't want to get too detailed, too specific. It is more than a week away. But this pattern looks more favorable to see something across the eastern United States, in particular the Northeast and maybe the Appalachians here down into Tennessee and Georgia. But again, it's 10 days away. Things are probably going to look slightly different than this on the big picture here. Taking a look at our next week of rain, it is going to pile up quickly. This will be one of our wettest weeks of the winter as we see some potentially tremendous amounts from Texas into the Tennessee Valley and into the central Gulf Coast states. That rain does advance into the Northeast. We see another wet week next week, especially Tuesday on, and the West Coast needs to get ready for significant rain. Northern Cal has the potential to see close to a foot in some places. Same goes for British Columbia, Western Washington, Northwest Oregon. I talked about this yesterday in my video to get ready for this. It is still coming. The degree of how much rain we see is going to vary in each model. Some models are going to be a little bit too wet, I think. But nonetheless, while we need some of this rain here in the south, a lot of this comes in just a couple of days, and that's going to cause us some problems here. Here's a look at the GFS showing our potential for rain. And you can see the amounts that it was showing a couple days ago have been lowered a little bit, but still we're seeing 9-10 inch amounts. Places like New Orleans, which is the last place you need to see that much rain. The city sits below sea level, but 5 to 10 inches across East Texas and significant rain up into Mississippi and Tennessee as well. And the only thing I'm going to promise you is that the details on this will continue to shift, but the pattern is certainly there and certainly conducive to a lot of rain. So that is what we need to be preparing for this upcoming week. The rest of the Southeast is going to turn pretty wet as well here, especially Alabama, Mississippi, Western Florida. The Florida Peninsula is actually going to get a break from the extremely wet weather we've had, which I personally am cool with. I'm going to Orlando for 4 days next week, and it doesn't look like much rain at all. So Florida gets a break from the very wet weather we've had. It doesn't mean it's going to be dry completely, but we should see more sunshine than we've seen pretty much the entire winter here, and warmer temperatures into the 70s and 80s. So we will take what we can get. We're getting wet again here in the Northeast. The GFS shows 2 to 4 inches of rain, and New England maybe potentially more than that. Down into the Carolinas, 2 to 3 inches. So unfortunately, we're paying for the warm up that we're having here later next week with significant amounts of precipitation. Out west, it's going to be pretty wet here, maybe flood threats for Arizona. Southern California, moderate flood threat, high flood threat, though, for Northern Cal, and further up the West Coast across the majority of the Pacific Northwest. We have a significant amount of rain coming. It's going to come pretty quickly here as well as the week wears on. Here's a look at our temperature anomalies, and you can see here's the cold in place today, where some places are still over 40 degrees Fahrenheit below the average this morning. Now that cold shifts east a little bit and then starts to diminish. And really our last chilly morning is going to be Monday morning. You can already see the warming coming after that. It'll be a little bit chilly here on Monday with cloud cover rolling in, but we do see a very drastic warm up coming Tuesday into Wednesday. Take a look at some of these very warm temperatures with respect to average. Portions of Ontario are 36 degrees Fahrenheit above average. If you balance out the anomalies, we had 50-degree below average temperatures last week into the early part of the weekend. Now 30-degree plus above average next week. That's an 80-degree temperature swing. That, folks, is the epitome of an El Nino winter. As the week wears on, the warmth continues across the east here later next week. Take a look at what's to come, though. We've got more cold that is set to move in at the end of the month. And the details on this are still going to be pretty uncertain at this point, but it is coming. So be prepared for another outbreak of very cold weather here as we pay for the warmth that we're getting the following week here on the 29th to the 31st of January and maybe into early February as well. By the way, when you see a contrast like this between Maine and New York, that certainly means there's going to be a threat for an East Coast storm if this is correct, when you have this kind of contrast. But again, no promises as to who's going to see what. We're still too far out to even try to take a stab at that. Here's how cold temperatures have been in the last 24 hours. This is the 24-degree change. So temperatures this morning are 25 degrees colder than they were a day ago this time in Atlanta. 22 degrees colder than they were a day ago in St. Louis, 21 degrees than they were a day ago in Indianapolis. So you are definitely cranking up the heat this morning as these temperatures have dropped significantly. But take a look at what's to come here. At the same time, we're reversing that with a 35-degree temperature drop or jump in just a day here on the Front Range of the Rockies, 34-degree temperature jump in northern Manitoba. So um, this is super extreme, but this is what the polar vortex does: is it leads to drastic temperature drops, and then once it leaves, drastic temperature climbs as well. Here is a look at our temperature forecast today, and we're going to struggle to get past freezing in Charlotte, Raleigh. We'll stay below freezing probably in Virginia Beach, Atlanta, Birmingham. This will be our coldest day, even mid 50s into central Florida. You really haven't been super cold, but you're going to be pretty chilly today. And then lows tonight are going to drop down to our coldest night of the season across the eastern U.S. Teens and 20s for many of us in the southeast, 40s in central Florida. Still not quite that cold yet in South Florida. That front gets kind of hung up there. But you can see west of the Rockies on west, we are much warmer here for the night tonight. Tomorrow will not be quite as brutally cold, but it'll still be a cold day across the east and the Great Lakes. As we head, though, into early next week, those temperatures very quickly start to rebound. Um, Let me back this up for you guys and show you what Sunday night temperatures are going to look like. So we have this moisture spreading up into areas where temperatures are in the teens and 20s. They will jump pretty quickly into the 30s and 40s on Monday, but that transition where the temperatures are rising, but they're still below freezing, is where our problems are going to exist here across this region. As we get into Monday night, we still have temperatures struggling to get past freezing at night. While these are above average, they are still not below freezing. And so I do expect we're going to see issues with icing here across the Great Lakes. It does start warming up Tuesday, though. We are back to near or above average, 70 degrees in Houston, 74 in Orlando, 75 in Tampa. Even the Northeast starts thawing out here, 30s and 40s, which is better than teens and 20s. As we get to the day on Wednesday, mid 60s in Raleigh, upper 70s in North Florida, and low to mid 80s in Central and South Florida. Even Minneapolis is a balmy 37. I know there'll be people up there wearing shorts with those kind of temperatures. Thursday, kind of the same deal here, 80s across all of Florida, 75 in Columbia, South Carolina, and in Myrtle Beach. Amazing when you look at what today's temperatures look like. Then you flash forward to Thursday. And then we are going to end the week Friday still on a warm note, as temperatures could get close to 80 in Jacksonville and just west of Savannah, Georgia. Although we are going to see cooler temperatures returning next weekend across the Northwest and then the North Central U.S. But we're going to enjoy 54 in Pittsburgh and 55 in Cincinnati for our highs on Friday. And these may not be warm enough. This is just the going forecast. Real quick, I know we got to wrap things up. Here's the cold in place across the east. We then see our moisture return here, pinks indicating freezing rain across Oklahoma and Arkansas. The time frame is going to be just before daybreak here on Monday, when we have the most significant ice. Maybe a little bit of snow around Chicago and in Michigan, but it is going to switch over to freezing rain here later Monday, and in particular Monday night. So we have what doesn't look like a very heavy storm, but one that'll be impactful as temperatures rise, and temperatures are very cold on the ground, even though the air temperature rises. And we eventually get into rain here around Toledo and Detroit. But before that transition early on Tuesday, it could be ice. Here's our next system moving out of the Texas to Tennessee River Valley area Tuesday night. Probably not a lot of severe weather right now. The flow doesn't really get very strong, but certainly a moist flow, and one that is likely to lead to some very heavy rain Wednesday and Thursday across the southeast. So we may be talking about thunderstorms here in Georgia, South Carolina, Northwest Florida, Alabama, into Louisiana, Mississippi, Thursday and Friday, because of that very warm air mass that's in place here, but probably not a major severe weather outbreak. At the end of next week, we see things quiet down just in time for next weekend, when we could have a rainstorm moving into the Northeast. There's cold air lurking to the north. I don't know yet if we're talking a winter storm yet in the Northeast. If it happens, it's probably more likely closer to the Canadian border, but the GFS says things are going to start getting more interesting again. And it also shows colder air getting ready to dive southeastward early the following week. And by the 29th and 30th, depending on how things line up, we could have a significant East Coast storm here around the 30th or 31st. But I'm showing this to you, but I'm giving you a word of caution that this is going to change 5,000 times between now and then. So while it does show a nor'easter, it doesn't mean necessarily that's going to be the case. It just means that the pattern here is more favorable, with all this moisture coming up the East Coast and the cold air wrapping in behind it. So stay tuned on that one for you guys. Here's a look at the ice threat here, and this is early in the day on Monday. Potentially a third of an inch of ice across much of Oklahoma and North Texas. Then you see that advancing north and eastward through the Ozarks towards St. Louis and central Illinois. This would be Monday into Monday evening. Very significant amount of ice potential here. Not like the one last winter, but still significant. Whoops. Here is a look. Sorry about that. All right, I'm going to use my keyboard here. Here's a look at what we're looking at for Monday afternoon, Monday evening. Amounts start picking up across central and then northern Indiana and Illinois into southwestern Michigan. And generally speaking, 1 to 2/10 of an inch of ice. So enough to cause problems. We'll probably have some power outages across this area, depending on how heavy this ice ends up being. But even southwest Ontario, northwest Ohio, and southern Michigan are at risk of significant ice during the day on Tuesday. And finally, looking at New England and the Northeast, we do have an ice threat that should evolve here as well. And that will start here during the day on Tuesday in northern Ohio, the Pennsylvania, New York border region here, the Twin Tiers, what I guess we call it, and then maybe into the Poconos and into interior New England here late Tuesday night and into the first part of Wednesday. And these can certainly still shift. This is one run of the GFS, but it does show some ice here in the interior of the Northeast, as well as across Southeast Ontario and Southwestern Quebec, with the primary timeline for this coming Wednesday into early Thursday morning. And I did want to mention, we do have things heating up quite a bit here in the Indian Ocean and especially in the South Pacific. And our next area of concern is a potential threat to Queensland and northeastern Australia. We have Invest 90P here that we're keeping an eye on. Models are showing development of this pretty rapidly here next week. Even tomorrow, we may have a tropical storm. And then I guess we call it a willy willy. I'm not really sure what they call it, or just a tropical cyclone. But this is Tuesday night and Wednesday, and what could be the equivalent of a Category 3 or even Category 4 hurricane, according to the GFS, making landfall here sometime on Wednesday night or Thursday in northeastern Australia, and then sitting around and producing quite a bit of rain. So we'll be watching that here next week. But I've got to get rolling here. I know you guys have a busy weekend. I always appreciate your time. I do not take any bit of that for granted. I'm trying to make my videos shorter, but the weather is not cooperating, unfortunately, for that. We just have so much to watch, and I know I'm leaving some of you guys out. And if I have left you out, that's a good thing. That means you're not dealing with anything too extreme. But I try not to leave people out. I try to include everybody. So thank you so much for your time today. Please consider becoming a subscriber. I would very much appreciate that if you could share it with your friends as well. So I thank you guys so much. You mean the world to me. But what really means the world to me is that I'm a child of God, and I give God all the glory for blessing me so that I can bless you. And really just thanking God for giving me some grace here, because there are times where I just want to put myself first and not others first. I think we all get to that point where we're like, man, we got to take care of ourselves, or man, I want to try to do this myself. I don't want to give any of this over to God. And not everybody, I understand, believes in God or believes in Jesus, but and I respect that, by the way, because I wasn't a believer until I was about 30 years old. But once I did accept that Jesus Christ is my Savior, things really did change for me. Paul tells the church of Corinth in 2 Corinthians 2:9 that, and he said unto me, and he referring to the Lord, he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. My grace is sufficient for me. Once I realized this, then I realized that I was forgiven, that I was good enough, and that God has made my weakness, or has given me strength made perfect in my weakness. And that is why I give God all the glory, knowing that I may be weak, but God makes me strong, and I don't have to do it all myself, that I am forgiven, that grace is sufficient, that while I may sin, while we all may sin, while we all may rush to judgment, not knowing the full situation, that God is still in control, and we can turn things over to him, and he can work wonders in us. So I want to just encourage you that today, because I see the comments on here, some people that are frustrated with things, people that are judgmental, but I forgive you because I'm already forgiven. You can say whatever you want. It's not going to affect me. Trust me. I do hope that you take some time to maybe go back and realize why I said what I said. But just know that um, I too am a sinner just like you. I too need forgiveness. And the nice part about it is because I've accepted Jesus as my savior, I am forgiven. And I pray that you are in that situation as well, because that is a life that allows you to bless more people ever than ever. To try to do it yourself and bless people, you just can't do it. But if you become a believer in Jesus Christ, then you've already been blessed, and that gift can be given to anybody else. And that's the gift I wanted to share with you today. So I'm going to pray for everybody offline here, but if you have any specific prayer requests, I'm happy to pray for you today. Hope you guys have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you Monday morning. Take care.